Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses. To date, do we know the full amount of improper payments, COVID funds, Mr. Dodaro?
There are estimates that have been made on the unemployment insurance area in 2020. The estimate was improper payments was $78 billion, up from about $9 billion in 2020. And then there was another $18.9 billion of improper payments reported by the Unemployment Insurance Program for 2022. And that was a 22% error rate.
Yeah.
And the year before was an 18.9 error rate. Prior to the pandemic, it was about 9%. In the PPP and EIDL areas combined, it is about $36 billion.
So we're talking $135 billion.
Yeah, just in those
doing the
few
math
programs.
in my head,
Yeah.
as you know I like to do.
Yes, I do.
It appears to me that some federal agencies might not have been as forthcoming with information as both you and Mr. Horowitz would have needed. Small Business Administration potentially violated federal law by failing to respond to the GAO's request. Has that been the case, that they've not responded to your request?
It was early on in the start of the programs. It's gotten much better. And I actually had to go, and back in 20 and 21, I testified before the Coronavirus Select Committee, and I had called the chair and ranking members of the small business committees, both the authorizers and the appropriators, to get help. I mean, we couldn't get any information out of SBA at all. And it wasn't until later there was a lawsuit where they had to then disclose the amounts of loans. Now it's gotten better.
Well, one of the problems is that the unemployment insurance programs authorized under the CARES Act were excluded from the program's total reported improper payments because they were not in existence for more than 12 months. And these programs represented about 70% of the unemployment payments in 2020. Should Congress consider legislation to reform the improper payments reporting periods in order to more accurately track the COVID relief funds and in the future if we have to have this again?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of my legislative recommendations.
I would appreciate, and I've enjoyed working with both you and Mr. Horowitz over the years on things like this, if you would provide to me in writing your recommendations for legislative fixes. I want to move to something else. It's been discussed about what actions Republicans took, and I just want to ask you if we had required two-factor identification for online applications or provide state unemployment agency by fax, email, or other means of transmission a copy of the claimant's state ID. If we had utilized protocols to prohibit applications from foreign IP addresses, if we denied claimants using virtual private network identification, require individuals, I could go down this whole list of things. Would that have helped reduce the amount of fraud?
Yes.
Well, I just want to point out, Mr. Chairman, that these are recommendations that were made by Republicans in the House and Senate, including myself. I introduced a bill to do this that were largely ignored. When we began to see the massive amount of fraud, as early as I think April, May of 2020, Mr. Horowitz, I think, and working with the Department of Labor, the Office of Inspector General there, that billions of dollars had already gone out, and we couldn't get these guardrails back in. Would that have helped, Mr. Horowitz?
Absolutely, and the fraud did start right off the bat. I mean, the PPP program sent out $400 billion in 2 weeks.
Let me ask one other question. What we've seen in the last few months here is states using their COVID relief funds for things like New Jersey, $15 million in state and local fiscal recovery funds to bolster the state's bid to host the 2026 World Cup. We saw the state of Washington send out $128 million in $1,000 payments to 120,000 illegal immigrants. We saw Colorado Springs use $6.6 million to put an irrigation system at 2 local golf courses, $5 million state of Massachusetts pay off debts incurred by Edward N. Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate in Boston, where are any of those improper uses of funds? I mean, I know we wanted to give them flexibility, but isn't that a little bit out of the box?
Yeah, well, there are broad uses authorized in the legislation for that money. We're looking at it right now, and so we'll try to identify those areas. They may be out of bounds legally, but it reminds me of the Recovery Act, when there was a lot of questions about the use of the money, whether that was appropriate or not, when it was really, legally authorized, because we gave the government gave great flexibility to the state and local community to make decisions. The other issue you have to deal with always at the money at the state and local level is fungibility of the money.
Well, they didn't have that early on, and Mr. Chairman, I think this might be something we want to look into, because it's not just the fraud, it's the improper use of some of the funds, and my time has expired. I always enjoy hearing from you guys. I yield back.
Absolutely. Chair recognizes Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. This hearing is called Federal Pandemic Spending, a Prescription for Waste, Abuse, and Fraud. UI, unemployment assistance, the Paycheck Protection Program, all of it. And in the wind-up to this hearing on January 13th, I see that the chair sent several letters to 3 states, Pennsylvania, California, and my home state of New York, with serious allegations of widespread fraud and abuse. But I'm curious a little bit about how we got to these 3 states. Mr. Daddario, if you were auditing or investigating what went wrong in states in the distribution of pandemic-related unemployment insurance, how would you go about choosing which states to examine?
Well, we would look at a number of factors. One would be the amount of money that would go there. We would look for geographic distribution of the programs. We would look for other characteristics of state programs, a number of claims, for example, that have been there. And so we would take a nationwide sample.
And even, in your experience looking at perhaps even something like a per capita approach or in your expertise, if you had to estimate some of the top candidate states, what do you think some of those states would be and why? And again, more on like a per capita level.
Yeah, I don't have the per capita numbers in my head, so I don't want to venture a guess at this point. I'd be happy to provide something for the record.
Overall, let's say not from per capita, what would be some of the top states that you would look at in terms of your experience and oversight of these programs?
Well, certainly California and New York are always candidates to look at in those cases, but you have Michigan, you have Florida, you have states in the South and the West, and then, so we would have a geographic distribution in order to make sure that we cover the money. What we try to do in these cases is cover, like right now, we're looking at the state and local coronavirus relief fund, and we've selected 18 states, and we're looking at, they account for about 60% of the total amount of money.
Thank you, Mr. Daddario. I'd like to submit to the record this report from the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee entitled Key Insights State Pandemic Unemployment Insurance Programs. Now, Mr. Hartz and Mr. Daddario, can you think of any methodology that would have brought the committee to send those 3 letters specifically to just those 3 states? Is there any methodology you can think of that would just result in Pennsylvania, New York, and California being under investigation by this committee?
Well, I would defer to the committee. I don't really know what their objectives were in that case, and I don't think.
I understand.
Yeah.
Now, I want to dig into this report. According to this report, PRAC, for example, Arizona paid $1.6 billion to individuals to stolen identities to get unemployment insurance benefits. Louisiana dispersed more than $1 million to individuals after the date of their death. And in Kentucky, state employees applied for unemployment benefits while still employed by the state and were able to hack the state's information management system and remove holds on their own accounts, and none of these states have been put under investigation by this committee. I find it very interesting because as was stated at the beginning, the bipartisan nature of oversight is what gives it its power. And what we are seeing are investigations into, and I believe that the methodology for these 3 states is highly questionable. I ask for this committee, if we're going to perform oversight, then let's perform oversight. Congressional Democrats are ready to perform that oversight and help our constituents get the benefits they need to pay their bills. And I think that there's no shortage of members of this committee who are willing to stand up to their own party when it's necessary. But I cannot, for the life of me, understand why the majority would send these 3 letters just to these 3 states that leave us with no other conclusion that there needs to be some rank partisanship in this investigation. Committee Republicans, I ask, if we're going to start off, let's do it right. And with that, I yield my time.
Before I yield back, if Ms. Ocasio-Cortez is willing, I would love to join in a joint investigation of the Kentucky unemployment system and New York unemployment system if you wanted to do that, a joint probe or whatever. I would love to work with you on that, or any of the 50 states, because I believe it's a problem in all 50 states, especially Kentucky. You're exactly right. Chair recognizes Mr. Higgins for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We knew there'd be fraud because fraud is always connected to money. I supported the CARES Act. That was the nation's initial response to the new virus. We didn't know what it was. The CARES Act was our effort to respond and to help American families and American employees remain financially stable while we endured the impact of this unknown virus. So here we are into year 4 of 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And is very well falls upon this committee under Republican majority to begin conducting meaningful oversight into the massive fraud that was no doubt staged to take place when you start rolling out programs with trillions of dollars. Some estimates as high as $7 trillion, the total economic commitment from the United States of America. American treasure, $7 trillion. That's 7,000 billion. It's 140 billion per sovereign state. There's an average of 62 counties per state. That's over 2 billion per county. I would argue that Americans across the country in local and state government would say they'd have done much better if every county could have received $2.2 billion in the form of a block grant. Of course, there was going to be massive fraud with programs like this. But what we expected was not the absence of fraud. What Americans expected is the presence of accountability and criminal prosecution. And that's what that accountability is what this Republican-controlled oversight committee is going to deliver. We know fraud is not born in the mechanisms of man. Fraud is born in the heart of man. It's to be anticipated. The gentleman referred to certain trade-offs between urgency and processes that were put in place as these trillions of dollars were set to be dispersed. Well, may I say that we anticipated this, but some of us, in order for the most conservative of us to support a $2 trillion response to this unknown virus, we insisted that this money be made available through local banks and credit unions, and we pushed the SBA product out through, my recollection is about 4,500 lending institutions that had never handled SBA product before. We wanted and we insisted that regular Americans would be able to communicate directly with the bankers they knew to access this assistance. So we knew it was ripe for fraud, but we expected criminal investigations to take place, and we expected people to be put in jail. Accountability for criminal acts generally begins with a suspicion and a report at the local level of fraud, theft, forgery, identity theft, etc. That leads to an investigation, should lead to an arrest, should lead to prosecution, should lead to conviction and incarceration. May I say, America would be just fine had we witnessed that kind of accountability. But it has to be pushed out of congressional investigations. That hasn't happened for the last 3 years. It will happen now. Director Smith, sir, specifically regarding investigations, that it's understandable that the most massive cases will be prioritized, millions and millions of dollars. But according to my research, the vast amount of fraud that we have witnessed is primarily from smaller cases, and I've been advised that they've gone ignored. Can you speak to that, sir? What are we doing at the federal level to assist local and state investigators to go after these smaller cases?
Sir, as I mentioned before, we follow money, we follow evidence, and one of the things that I talked about in my opening was the Secret Service training state, local law enforcement professionals at our National Computer Forensics Institute. It's the ultimate teach a man to fish, if you will. We train thousands of state and local law enforcement professionals every year to be able to investigate cases locally. I was just down in the chairman's home state last week in Kentucky, talking to some of our cyber fraud task force partners, and they were actually briefing me on cases they were working at a local level that were focused on elder abuse and some pandemic-related fraud. So we are a federal law enforcement entity, but we do have a responsibility to help train, equip, and resource our local partners who help us in every aspect of our mission to be able to build their capacity locally.
Thank you for your response, Director. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Porter for 5 minutes.
Good morning. I have questions about unemployment insurance. Mr. Dodaro, could you read this headline for the room? Yeah. Could you hold your microphone on, sir?
I'm sorry. California's EDD unemployment system disaster, predictable fiasco.
Thank you. Mr. Horowitz, could you please, we're going to get everyone in on the fun. Mr. Horowitz, could you please read this headline?
There is no way I can read this headline
Okay,
because
I'll
I
read
didn't
it for
bring my
you.
glasses with me.
EDD's new software has thousands of defects, some critical. Mr. Smith, we'll see. Well, it's also an eye test in case you need to get a checkup. Can you read that for me, Mr. Smith?
It says the North Carolina Unemployment Agency is a broken system.
A broken system. North Carolina Unemployment Agency, a broken system. Mr. Horowitz, do these headlines seem familiar? Do they seem representative of the problems regarding unemployment system during the pandemic?
They do.
They do. Would it surprise you to know that all of these news stories are from 2013 and 2014, long before COVID-19 was a problem?
Not at all. This has been an issue that GAO has spoken about for decades, maybe. I'm not sure if it's that long, but certainly we have as IGs as well. The unemployment insurance system needs to be fixed.
I could not agree more. So let's talk about that and how we can fix it. What these headlines show, of course, is that, as you said, state unemployment agencies have long had problems getting help to people who need it and preventing our tax dollars from ending up in the wrong hands. When the pandemic first began, we needed to deliver relief quickly. But due to chronic underinvestment in technology and systems at states that administer programs, we saw the same problems with waste, fraud, and abuse that we've seen for decades under Democratic and Republican presidents in blue states and red states. Mr. Dodaro, I want to talk about the GAO's high-risk list. What is that?
A high-risk list was originally created to identify for the Congress and the administration areas across federal government that we believe were highly susceptible to fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement, or in need of broad-based transformation as it evolved.
Did GAO identify unemployment system, UI, as a high-risk program?
Yes,
When?
in 2022.
June of 2022. In June of 2022, the year before unemployment was added to the high-risk list, do you know what the rate was of overpayment for unemployment insurance?
It was, in 2021, it was 18.9%.
Great. And according to the Department of Labor, before that, before you put it on the high-risk list, it was about 15%. In 2019, it was about 9.5%. In 2018, it was 12.1%. In fact, the overpayment rate has been over 10% for 14 of the last 18 years, according to the Department of Labor's OIG. When GAO announced that the unemployment system had been designated as high risk, you said, quote, GAO is concerned that many long-standing problems may go unaddressed. Do you remember saying that?
I believe so, yes.
Is that a little bit of an understatement at this point?
Well, you know, for many of those years, it was mostly state money that was collected. There really wasn't big federal investment in this until the pandemic broke, or perhaps earlier in some other emergency situation. So, but I thought the time obviously was right.
Yeah, what the OIG has said is the UI program has experienced some of the highest improper payment rates across the federal government. So my question is, why don't we fix this?
Well, I think it requires some leadership on the part of the Congress and the Labor Department. You know, like a lot of these programs that where the federal government's relying on the state and local governments, they give them a lot of discretion. And when times are good, unemployment's low, you know, they don't get a lot of attention until these problems come up.
So here's how I think about this. When someone has a dollar and they lose a dime of it, they think, shucks. But when someone has $100 and they lose $10, they're like a little angry. And it just keeps going up, and now we're in the billions and trillions. So I would love to have your continued pressure on the Department of Labor to use all of the funding that Congress provided in the American Rescue Plan to actually modernize UI, because I'm trying to add up where that $2 billion from the American Rescue Plan has gone, and it does not seem to have all been deployed and spent to improve these programs.
Yes, no, I agree. We're going to follow that $2 billion. Also, I was in the Senate testifying last March with Michael Horowitz and the IG from the Labor Department. He mentioned the money that was given states after the Great Recession to reform the programs, and he mentioned some of that money went unused.
No, it absolutely did. Mr. Chair, if you'll indulge me for just 1 minute. In California, after the American Recovery Act, they were given a $2 million grant to EDD to prevent fraud. And guess what? It worked. At the end of the grant program, California quit using the fraud detection program. Penny wise and pound foolish, because that exact fraud detection program would have prevented and saved tens of billions of dollars for federal taxpayers during this pandemic. So I appreciate the chairman's indulgence, and I yield back.